Welcome to Dig Deep, the mining podcast. In this podcast, we go deep into mining news, hot topics, and live interviews with mining professionals and leading figures in the mining industry. Introducing your host, Rob Tyson, founder and director of Mining International and Mining International Executive, a leading global mining recruitment and headhunting agency.
Hi, mining community. Welcome back to another episode of the Dig Deep, the mining podcast, the show that brings you the latest insights, thought leadership, and stories from across the global mining industry. Today's episode, we're joined by Tim Foden, who's the partner of Boies Schiller Flexner, one of the most well-known and formidable litigation firms in the world. Tim has built a reputation for tackling complex, betting the company disputes, navigating some of the most challenging legal battles across our industries. In this conversation, we're going to explore Tim's path into the company, what it takes to succeed in elite litigation environments, how lawyers think about strategy when the pressure obviously is really on and the consequences obviously are real. We're also going to talk about the evolving role of trial lawyers, lessons learned from major cases, and what young attorneys and even business leaders can take away from top litigators' approach in decision making and risk. So whether you're a lawyer, whether you're a founder of a business, or simply curious about how I suppose major legal battles are fought and won, this episode offers a rare insight and hopefully provide you with some context. So Tim, welcome to the podcast. How you doing?
Thanks so much, Rob. It's great to be here. This is my second time on the podcast, and the last time proved to be a great success. I'm really grateful to you for having me because we had a number of mining companies reach out to us on account of the podcast that we did together. So very much looking forward to being back on the pod, as they say.
Yeah, great. Well, as you mentioned, you've been on the podcast before. It's probably a year and a half, 2 years ago.
Almost 2 years ago, yeah.
2 years ago.
Yeah.
So for those that obviously didn't listen to that episode, appreciate if you go back and listen to that episode. But for those that are unfamiliar, didn't listen to that episode, may not know about yourself and the company, just wondered if you can just give us a overview of yourself and your career, and obviously what the company does.
Yeah, sure. So as you can probably tell from my accent, although I'm based in London, I'm an American lawyer by training. I'm a courtroom litigator, and I became qualified to practice law in England 15 years ago. And right after that, I moved to London, and I've been working here ever since. First in Allen & Overy, big sort of global law firm, and then for a number of specialist disputes boutiques. I joined Boies Schiller Flexner 4 years ago to take up a leadership position in his London office and really to kickstart our international arbitration practice. I came to that role having focused largely on the mining sector. My start in the mining sector was handling some construction-related disputes, some involving fraud. You know, someone says they can sink a mine shaft through running sands a kilometer deep, doesn't do it, and then ends up in a dispute over it. And when you start as a disputes lawyer, you gain a little bit of knowledge about a specialist area, and before you know it, you start getting put on more cases that have the need for that specialist knowledge. And this is sort of was my entry point to mining. And before I knew it, I was doing cases for Rio Tinto, Barrick, AngloGold Ashanti, and the like. And somewhere along that way, I realized that there was a bit of a gap in the market. And that market gap was that junior mining companies would often find themselves in disputes around the world, sort of at a real disadvantage to sovereigns. And if they ended up losing their asset as a result of that dispute, sort of typically as a consequence of resource nationalism, they were really up the creek without a paddle. And so what I started to do, and very few other people in the industry were actually doing at that time, was marry those companies with third-party litigation finance. And we were really successful in doing that. We brought a number of claims on behalf of junior mining companies against sovereigns. And we talked about a few of those in the last podcast that we did together. that success led to a bit of a shift in the career, in that now, and this was really the focus of the last podcast, a lot of those companies started to call me earlier. I think the title of the last podcast was "Don't Be Afraid to Get a Lawyer Involved Early." And in the 2 years intervening since our meeting, the companies are getting me involved earlier. So these days, a lot of the practice is sort of parachuting into jurisdictions, trying to handle negotiations with governments, trying to come to some kind of accommodation whereby they don't actually end up in a formal dispute, and in some ways make my career or my job a bit obsolete. Of course, we're not always successful in doing that, so we often bring the disputes as well. But really, we see ourselves as problem solvers, whether that's with the sovereign, a joint venture partner, even a contractor. We're there to try to avoid certain outcomes, and we have a very distinct philosophy about how we go about doing that.
Yeah. You mentioned just now getting yourself involved in early, obviously companies employing your services earlier. What kind of examples would you say, or when is the situation where straight away you should be contacting an organization yourself because a certain scenario has happened? Is there sort of any examples that I suppose many people may not even necessarily think about engaging your services or even speaking to you initially? What are some of the examples where companies have picked up the phone to you and contacted you and say, look, I think I might need your services because of this and this happening?
Yeah, so there's a couple of paradigm type examples. Um, the first and most often time that we get a phone call is when there's a change in the mining code. Even if the mining code, they're starting to talk about a change, there's a draft in front of the relevant legislature. Chances are there's going to be significant changes for your project, even an exploration level project, and we should have a talk. And it might be that that talk says, you're fine. Don't worry about it. Go ahead, keep drilling. You'll be okay. But typically, you need us to sort of say, well, this is the areas where it's going to hurt, and here are the areas where we think we can push back on that based on whatever agreements you have in place, based on how you've structured your investment using an investment treaty sort of holding structure that enables you to leverage that against the state and say, hey, you need to make an exception for us. What's more is that in our experience, new mining codes are often applied to companies, even if they have some form of stabilization agreement or a contract with the state. So those sort of old contracts can be run roughshod over by a state that's decided that it needs to get more out of the situation. So what if you take, for example, Mali? This is perfect example. Mali enacts a new mining code in 2023, and everyone has these existing mineral development agreements or conventions, mining conventions, that on their face suggest that they should be immune from any changes. Yet, all of a sudden the state's turning up and saying, you have to go on the code. And so our role there, to varying degrees of success, I should say, was to try and find ways to avoid the worst of it. So that's one situation. Another situation is you've got a joint venture partner that you don't trust necessarily anymore, and you can tell that they might be doing some things to you and or behind your back. And this is a situation I found myself in very recently. I had to fly off to the Middle East to negotiate with a JV partner that was going around our clients back to the sovereign and trying to get the license revoked so that they could end up with the license. And I'm often brought in there as the sort of the hammer to say, no, 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 you don't get to do that. And if you do, there's going to be a real problem. And I'm going to be your problem. The other situation is any kind of tomfoolery with respect to your security of tenure or license rights. You know, if you get the sense that someone has raised the question about whether the transfer of your title was done properly, well, then you know that you're going to likely face even more severe sanctions, and you need to get us involved. The I've got two more examples. The other is, say you have some form of agreement with the state that's coming up on the end of its life. Well, you can expect that they're going to want a much better deal. You should have us look over the agreement to see what rights of renewal you have or had and get us involved in trying to negotiate something. We work with sovereigns here. We don't always just go in and say no. We say, okay, well, look, they're going to want more. Let's try and work out some kind of compromise so we don't all end up in arbitration. The last example, and one that keeps us very, very busy, and that a lot of the listeners of this podcast might be unfamiliar with, is, do you have a problem with a blockade, with illegal mining, or some form of incursion by third parties on your mining footprint? If you do, you may have contractual rights that allow you to push back on the state for failing to provide the necessary law and order at the site and security. You might have treaty rights that require that the sovereign provides what we call full protection and security. But needless to say, the blockade type situation runs at a very sensitive intersection between the rights of the miner and the social license concept that we need to be all mindful of. And we are seeing increasingly that where the mining company is subject to a form of blockade, states will take the side of the blockaders, do very little, and then some time, months, weeks, years later, when a lawsuit materializes, the state just says, oh, well, the mining company should have done more. Even if that mining company has done everything in its power to try and make it work, and the blockaders are beyond irrational. And that is one of the situations that we see very often in Mexico, for instance, right now. So those are the sort of 5 areas in which most people give us a call and are calling us at an earlier juncture increasingly.
And I suppose at the moment, there's a lot of geopolitics in the mining industry. What some of the work have you been sort of focusing on lately?
So, I do see this a lot. Everyone keeps talking about, mining really is geopolitics. Well, I mean, honestly speaking, show me a time where it wasn't. It's just that some sovereigns get more robust in their demands on behalf of companies, and this waxes and wanes. In fact, the entire investment treaty arbitration framework for which I'm a huge advocate sort of stems from the fact that this is geopolitics. And 100 years ago, if you interfered with the mineral rights of a foreign investor, sometimes you'd have warships on your coast, right? And instead, what we're supposed to be doing is suing about these things. We find that more civilized than, for instance, starting a coup in a country. But this is a time where you see that major international powers are playing a much more robust role in the politics of mining and the security of tenure of companies, and particularly for projects that might be considered for critical minerals, obviously, but that's also incurring into the area of gold at this current gold price, and silver, I should say, as well. And so what I'm seeing a lot are major political powers, and by that I mean Middle Eastern concerns, US concerns, Chinese concerns, and now, very late to the game, the EU as a whole, trying to get in and weigh in on states that I would say for the past few years have been taking a really sort of trying to take advantage of high mineral prices, coups in their own country, and the sort of continued resurgence of resource nationalism to press down on mining companies. And all of a sudden, advice that I used to give to clients of don't think that the diplomatic corps is going to come to your aid is incorrect. And I'm not sheepish about saying that I'm wrong about that now. Sovereigns are increasingly putting diplomatic pressure on states to avoid the kinds of outcomes I was talking about, to get more involved, to restore licenses. And whilst I can't get into examples, I can tell you I've seen it with my own eyes. And it's been fun. You have to, the best part of my job is sort of being reactive, riding the wave, seeing how circumstances change and reacting to them. And when you've got a superpower sticking its beak into your specific project, that is a really interesting development, and one that, even the Biden administration, I have to say, they were very interested in critical minerals all throughout Africa, and they were trying to get involved. They just weren't doing it in the same way that perhaps this administration is doing.
What are some of the most common mistakes you see mining companies making, I suppose, at the site level, at site and permitting level, that later obviously come back to haunt them in disputes with governments?
Yeah, well, there's a number of examples of that, Rob, and some of them are, you know, ones that we don't often talk about. And I don't see it as often as you might think. But if you pay a bribe to get a license, to keep a license, or some extraordinary payment that, it is dressed up as something else, you might really have deprived yourself of the opportunity to bring a claim down the road. In investment treaty arbitration, you can only bring a claim in respect of an investment. And an investment means that it is made legally. And if someone was paid a bribe to obtain that investment, any tribunal hearing that case very well might determine that it does not have jurisdiction to do so. Now, that's typically only done where a state is willing to plead that a bribe has been made. And a lot of states don't like to do that. You wouldn't be surprised to know states don't like to acknowledge that some corruption has happened, even at the regional or local level. But increasingly, states are willing to throw their own people under the bus to get out of a potential claim. So that's one area. The other area is junior mining companies are run by frontiersmen, and I love it. These are folks that have gone into tough jurisdictions and intrepidly built something with their own toil, intelligence, and guile. The problem is sometimes they start to get into problems with the sovereign, and all of a sudden, having done everything on their own, they think they know best in that arena too. This is a sort of, quintessential characteristic or example of what's called, I think, the Dunning-Kruger effect. If you're good at one thing, you think you're good at all things. But you really need help. You need help because you can make mistakes, you can overpromise, and all of a sudden, that promise or that mistake will bite you. There's certain areas for this. So there's a real example that I always used to use of a mining company that ended up bringing a claim, very, very large claim. I won't name it, but every time the state did something that interfered with that project, they didn't want the share price to take a hit. So they're putting out a press release saying it's not that bad. We've got this covered. We're optimistic about it. Well, lo and behold, when they went to go do the claim several years later, every single one of those press releases got put in front of that CEO and said, "You're saying now that this case is about this state measure, and this state measure destroyed the company. But here you are on the 6th of January, 2007 saying it's not that bad." So this is the kind of area where we can add value, right? Seems true with illegal miners. You think that that's just a nuisance and that you've just got to handle it? No. We have examples of cases that we have done, again, not to be named here, where our pressure involved with the state and the awareness of the rights that the company had vis-a-vis the state was instrumental in getting those illegal miners off the site. Those are just a couple of examples of mistakes that get made, but also, we still see a thing where people think that their handshake or their faith in negotiations is good enough. But we often see that our clients just don't paper things over as much as we'd like them to. We know that you're trying to build a project, not a lawsuit. Okay? So your first inclination isn't to send a letter every time someone has a sneeze. But it makes our job a lot easier when you do. And the other thing is, one of the reasons, why do people avoid getting in touch with us? Well, they think that we're going to be really expensive. And, our rates are high. We're lawyers, right? But we're here to help companies. The best form of business development that I've ever done is doing a solid for a company early doors, either relatively cheaply or with some kind of fixed fee. and then avoiding an outcome altogether. And then guess what? That outcome is avoided. We've made a friend. That friend goes and tells another company that is in deeper trouble. And before you know it, we've got a big case in our hands. So we are commercial operators. Not all of our competitors are, but we have a model here at Boies Schiller Flexner that allows us to be flexible. And that flexibility enables us to help smaller companies in a way that is commensurate with their budgets and their treasury in order to avoid more catastrophic circumstances.
What's your take on the so-called Chinese mining mafia? Obviously, they're buying up a number of assets all obviously around the world and joint venturing with some companies in various locations. Just wonder what your take on I suppose the country's activity within the mining industry.
My take changes all the time. I can tell you that the time I spent in Mali, the Chinese had a different way of doing things, and they were the favored business partner of the Malians. Um, they really wanted to do business with the Russians, but this was happening in 2023, and Russia was distracted, and the Wagner Group was obviously falling apart, and so the Chinese were sort of second best. But it was to do business with them over the Westerners at any point. I think that that's probably changing. And I think that the Chinese way of doing business, which I won't get into the details of, was a phenomenon unto itself. But even then, I see the Chinese as starting to operate very differently than I did even a year ago. Um, they have rubbed a lot of states the wrong way in Africa, for instance, and that has led to sort of a begrudging relationship, but one where the Chinese are receiving more pressure than they had before, and all of a sudden starting to think, well, we need to press back in ways that are more legalistic than sort of some of the more ad hoc ways, I'll put it, than they had been prior to. So that's all a really convoluted way of saying, I'm getting calls from Chinese companies now. They're reaching out to me. They want to know about their rights. They want to know how I can help in certain jurisdictions where they've had troubles. And I find that as a really encouraging sign. Uh, I've had calls with Chinese companies just in the past week and about certain jurisdictions. You're also seeing Chinese companies bringing an increasing number of claims. That said, a number of times that we bring in a new client, it's pretty obvious to us that a Chinese company is often lurking in the background of whatever sovereign measures our client is facing. And that may be very difficult for the client in the circumstances, but it will always form a very crucial and integral part of the narrative that underlies a claim down in the long run. Because the three tribunal members that hear our cases, uh, they're lawyers. They just need to decide whether a breach of a treaty or a contract has taken place. But we're humans as well, and humans want to know why. And if they can understand that you didn't just lose the project, but the project went to a neighboring Chinese company that had been sort of encroaching on your concession in the first place, the sudden reason for a rather pretextual claim of breach of a mining agreement all of a sudden makes a lot more sense.
What's the blunt advice you'll give to, I suppose, anyone considering investing in mining right now? And what red flags should they look for beyond the headlines?
Look, it depends on the jurisdiction, as always. The first advice is advice that I gave when we last met, which is the first thing you need to do is hire our law firm or lawyers with experience in investment treaty arbitration to map out your options to ensure that you have treaty protection. Um, Particularly in Africa and South America, you need to just make sure that you are creating a holding structure for that asset that does not simply optimize tax. Tax is only relevant if you've got a producing project. All right, guys? That is something that I see all the time. So you have all these holding structures that are set up through the likes of the Isle of Man or some offshore jurisdiction, the BVI. That's great when the project is 10 years down the road, constructed and making everyone a fortune, right? But your project is at risk very early doors. And if you don't hold the right treaty holding structure in place and you lose it, you might not have rights of recourse. And most of the sort of low tax offshore jurisdictions, with some notable exceptions, don't have investment treaties with hotspot jurisdictions. So if you're looking at sort of Channel Islands clients or companies, you need to be careful. If you're looking at Caribbean countries, you need to be careful. And what you need to do is insert a company in the holding structure before a dispute materializes, very important there, that will enable you to bring a claim down the road. Alternatively, you need to make sure that you have some form of agreement with the state that allows you to bring a dispute outside of the country. That's blunt advice number one. That's the same thing I've been saying for 15 years. There's new advice, though. If you are investing in critical minerals, go to Washington, have a chat with the U.S., see if you might be able to get DFC funding. Because I have to tell you, right now, I'm seeing the benefits that it can pay off. I didn't think that would be the case at the beginning of the administration because, there's only so much one administration can do. They're not going to look at for every project, but they've been a lot more robust in fighting for the rights of companies that they've invested in than I originally envisaged. And so there are material benefits to be gained from joining in some form of alliance with Foggy Bottom in Washington, D.C.
When you're obviously in the thick of an arbitration involving billions of dollars and the future of the company's resources, how do you feel personally in terms of managing being under that pressure?
There's really two elements to that, Rob. I mean, the first is that I try to do two things. I try to empathize with the plight of the client. And the second thing is I try to remain objective. So which are obviously two characteristics that can easily be in tension. But when I first meet with a client, I'm usually meeting with the CEO who has shareholders baying for their head. They have lost an asset. Sometimes they've lost an asset that they have spent months or years of their lives developing. They've brought it from literally a barren field to a project with a definitive feasibility study. And that is like a death. They are mourning. And if I was just to go in and talk to them only about how we're going to win the case, don't you worry, that wouldn't be doing them service as a client. We're a client-centered business. And in any dispute, we at Boies Schiller Flexner are making sure that we understand our client's business and, frankly, the pain that they're feeling as a consequence. So in the early days of some of my cases, my clients are sometimes looking to me like I'm almost like a psychotherapist. And I have to give a lot of sort of empathetic time to them. And I won't name those clients, but they know who they are. And it develops a real bond between lawyer and client early on. In tension with that is the objectivity that I need to maintain as a lawyer. I need to know what the weak spots are. And I can tell you that when they're in that mourning phase, there wasn't anything wrong with that project. They did everything right. And we need to have the uncomfortable discussion of saying, no, I need to know what our counterparty in a commercial dispute or the sovereign is going to be saying about your performance. And sometimes I need to say, look, I know you're upset about this, but they actually have a point here. So I need you to work with me to figure out what that point is. And that progresses from the earliest stages of client intake through to the hearing. Because when we do these hearings, it is an incredibly emotionally taxing phase. And my job as an advocate is to maintain some level of objectivity, because the best way I can argue my client's case is making sure that the tribunal believes me. And if I am just completely enthralled to everything they've told me and I can't give a point, then I lose my credibility and that client's likely to lose the case. So where I come from in Philadelphia, we have a brand of sports fan. They're all like this. I hate to say it. I'm not, I like to say, but a lot of them are like, we call them homers. The home team is never wrong. They've never done anything wrong. It's always the ref's fault. The other team were cheaters and our team could do no wrong. Well, I don't really believe in that. I'm not a homer for my clients. I'm there to tell you, yes, this is wrong. Yes, you've done some mistakes as well, but I still think we can win, and this is how we're going to do it. So I try to maintain those two things at the same time. I don't always get that balance right. Some of my clients could probably attest to, but that really is sort of, I think, key to our success. And we've had a lot of success over the past 3 years on behalf of these clients. They don't always see it like that at the beginning. You know, you get emails from clients that are outraged that you would even suggest that, you know, their feasibility study has holes in it, and that could create real issues for the damages case down the road. But by the end of the case, they do see it.
Tim, really appreciate your time. Thank you for obviously sharing your story. Give us an insight as to some of the work that you're involved in, and obviously some of the, I suppose, scenarios and projects where some of our listeners could be facing or potentially facing at any time during obviously their careers. So really appreciate you sharing your views and maybe possible answering to some of the challenges that they may be facing as a starting point. And if our audience wants to reach out to you, how can they go about doing that? What social media platform channels are you on? And where obviously they can maybe follow, get a little bit of advice and content that you may put out there. And obviously the first step of obviously engaging you and your services.
Yeah. So, I mean, look, relatively old school person, you can still always email me. The email address is on the website, tfoden@bsfllp.com. I'm very active on LinkedIn. I don't feel particularly proud of that. I'm not much of a social media guy, but we are the rare law firm in big disputes practice. We've got some competitors that do this that actually talk about our victories. That's been very successful for us from a business development standpoint, because guess what? Lawyers like mining companies like winners, and they like making money. And we've done that very well at doing that. So you can find me on LinkedIn. And I have to plug the fact that if you want to see what we do as lawyers, the best way to do that is to see the cases that we've done on YouTube. Part of the dispute framework that we deal with is a lot of cases are held in a transparent environment. And the World Bank's disputes resolution arm, called ICSID, posts some of these disputes. Maybe we can drop a link below on YouTube. And in particular, you can sort of see us in action on behalf of a Canadian gold mining company called Windshear in a case that we did against Tanzania. And I'd specifically refer your colleagues and your listeners to day 3 of that hearing, where you can see how we cross-examine witnesses. And the last thing I'll say about this is that a lot of the clients that need this empathy, they don't believe they're ever really going to have their day in court. And when they're reading the written word, they're seeing that their opponents are saying all sorts of lies. Well, the hearing is where they get their day in court, and where those lies are brought into the light and exposed for what they are, which is mendacious approach to evidence. And the cross-examinations that are on YouTube really flesh that out.
Great. Tim, thank you very much for your time. Hopefully you can come on sometime next year and give us an update on some of the work that you're getting involved in. And there could be new other types of scenarios that are coming into play now, as I believe the mining industry is now going to start really picking up. So I'd imagine you'll be working on a number of different cases.
I think that's right, Rob. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed the episode. As always, appreciate your continued support. Please share this episode far and wide, and especially with this episode, it is different to a lot of the other episodes that we have on the channel, where I guess most of you that are listening may have never used a lawyer in your day-to-day work, but you never know when that opportunity or that situation may arise where you might need to call on someone like Tim for certain advice. So it's really appreciate if you can share this episode to people that you know within the mining industry, no matter who they are, wherever they are in the world, because there's certainly some valuable content that our listeners can take away. So thank you again, and until next time, happy mining.
Thank you for listening. Remember to reach out to Rob via the show notes, and be sure to subscribe and leave a review. Until next time, happy mining, helping each other to improve the mining industry.